Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year is 1864, and the Ozarks of southern Missouri were already a troubled region. Civil strife from the war lingered in every hollow and ridge. Guerrilla fighters haunted the roads, families were uprooted, and institutions meant for learning often stood half-abandoned. It was in this atmosphere that the Holloway Seminary for Boys came into focus, an academy originally chartered as a place of Christian instruction, but one that quickly gained a reputation for disorder and unease. Records of its founding are uneven, scattered between county ledgers and church bulletins. The property itself was a timber-frame structure built on a low ridge above the White River Basin, purchased in 1858 by Reverend Josiah P. Holloway, a man known for stern discipline and fiery sermons. Holloway had formerly been a circuit preacher, though little is written of him before his sudden wealth allowed the purchase of land and building. The seminary was meant to provide instruction in Latin, Scripture, and the practical trades to a dozen boys at a time, sons of settlers and merchants who could afford a term's fee. The building was modest, described in an 1859 survey as a frame house of 2 stories, with a lofted garret and cellar beneath, well provisioned, with rooms suitable for dormitory and chapel. A single photograph exists, blurred and cracked, showing its narrow windows and tall chimney, the sort of place that might have seemed respectable in daylight, but foreboding when the lamps were lit. The first accounts of unease came from neighbors. A farmer's wife, Mrs. Eliza Dothit, late, testified that she heard the boys drilled after midnight, their voices raised not in hymn, but in shouts most unfit for the hour. Another local noted the boys were seldom seen outside the grounds, their exercise confined to a bare yard enclosed by a split-rail fence. It is difficult to piece together these early years, but glimpses surface in forgotten newspapers, often buried beside war reports. The Springfield Union printed a single line in February 1861. Concerns grow in Taney County regarding the Holloway Seminary, its discipline being of a severity uncommon even for these times. Yet no formal charges were brought. Parents who withdrew their sons often did so quietly, citing ill health or distance. To better understand this climate, one might recall how Missouri itself was torn in those years. The American Civil War in Missouri was not only a conflict of armies, but of neighbors and institutions. The seminary sat directly in this atmosphere of suspicion and shifting loyalties, its walls hiding much that county officials overlooked. Still, the case that came to be called disturbing had yet to emerge. It would be in the latter half of 1864, as the war crested, that rumors of missing boys, strange purchases recorded in the county store ledgers, and unexplained fires would draw unwelcome attention to the Holloway Seminary. What began as whispers of harsh discipline soon hardened into something that inspectors, ministers, and even army detachments could no longer ignore. By the summer of 1864, Holloway Seminary's reputation had grown more troubling. Enrollment records preserved in a fragment of county ledgers suggest that at least 24 boys had been admitted between 1859 and 1863, yet only 15 could be accounted for in parish registers by name. Some were said to have returned to their families. Others were claimed to have left for work or military service, but no letters survived to confirm these departures. Parents who inquired often found the correspondence slow, vague, and written not by the boys themselves, but in Reverend Holloway's stiff hand. One complaint, filed by a trader named William Henshaw, described paying full-term fees for his nephew, only to receive a notice 6 months later that the lad had taken ill and perished of fever, his body interred on the grounds. Henshaw sought to recover the effects of his kin, but was told that all was consumed in a fire of the dormitory room. The fire in question left no record in the county's incident log. These discrepancies began to accumulate, though few dared to press them formally, as the war had displaced officials and hollowed out courts. In this power vacuum, Reverend Holloway's word often stood uncontested. Still, unease spread. 2 farmhands reported seeing boys lined up in the yard at dusk, their posture unnaturally stiff, their heads shaved close. Another spoke of chants drifting across the valley long after midnight, rhythmic but not identifiable as hymns. The voices, he said, rose and fell as if guided by metronome, not spirit. In August of that year, a circuit judge, passing through Forsyth, heard such rumors and dispatched a constable, Elias Rooker, to inspect the premises. Rooker's surviving notes are sparse, but one page preserved in county archives reads, "The boys appear pale and listless. Their quarters are close, windows nailed. Reverend Holloway refuse. His entry to cellar on grounds of dampness and hazard. Boys do not speak freely in his presence." Rooker marked his intention to return, but no follow-up is recorded. Against this backdrop, the Holloway Seminary became a subject of whispered folklore among locals. They spoke of wagons arriving at night, crates unloaded at the rear of the building, their contents concealed. Some swore that the distant toll of a bell could be heard, though no steeple was visible on the structure. These tales might have been dismissed as wartime anxiety, had not 2 new cases emerged. Boys listed on the rolls who were never seen by neighbors, not at market, not at Sabbath service. One, identified as Thomas Lyle of Dent County, was said to have been delivered by his uncle in late September. Yet the boy's name appears only once in the seminary register, with no subsequent mention. His family later received a terse letter declaring he had departed for other employ, though no employer was named. Such patterns invited suspicion, and by autumn the seminary stood increasingly isolated, its fence mended high, its windows shuttered, and its residents rarely glimpsed except as pale figures in the yard. The unease of the community was mounting, though few could yet foresee the disturbing revelations that lay within those walls. The earliest testimonies that survive concerning Holloway Seminary emerged in October of 1864, preserved in a scattering of depositions now filed under county miscellany. These statements came not from parents, who often lived many miles away, but from townsfolk of Taney County who observed the institution from without. One account, by a miller named Horace Beale, described hearing the steady striking of iron against stone after midnight, as though work were conducted beneath the house. Beale claimed the sound carried through the still valley air long after the lamps were doused. Another testimony came from Mrs. Sarah Kinney, whose brother had once boarded at the seminary. She reported that on a visit she found the dining hall silent, the boys eating without a word, their eyes lowered. When she attempted to converse, Reverend Holloway intercepted her with a hand on her shoulder, insisting that the discipline of silence was a necessary trial. County clerk notation suggests these complaints were bundled into a file for further review, but the upheaval of war meant little follow-up. Local newspapers, too, were preoccupied with the wider conflict, though the Springfield Union briefly mentioned in November 1864 that unfavorable reports had arisen about the Holloway Seminary, placing it in the same column as troop movements. What pushed the matter toward a more structured inquiry was the arrival of Reverend Samuel Grayson, a Methodist minister known for his temperance work. Grayson had passed through the Ozarks delivering sermons and distributing tracts, and upon hearing local concerns, he made a personal visit. His notes, preserved in church archives, describe a place of unnatural quiet, where even the birds seemed absent. He was denied entry to the cellar, as Constable Rooker had been months earlier, though he noted a foul odor rising from its grates. Grayson wrote, "The boys, pale of face, some with bruises upon their wrists, moved as if under command, not affection. Their recitations were hollow, without spirit." Such words, though restrained, reveal the unease that even a man of the cloth felt within those walls. By late autumn, parents who had managed to recover their sons spoke of illness, nightmares, and an unwillingness to speak of their time there. One affidavit from Dr. Nathan Cole, a physician in the nearby settlement, mentions treating 2 boys for malnutrition and strangely patterned burns upon the forearm. When asked how they had occurred, the boys refused answer, stating only that they belonged to the seminary. It was around this time that parallels were drawn by later historians to the instability in the broader state. The American Civil War in Missouri had disrupted oversight of schools, orphanages, and seminaries, leaving figures like Holloway with unchecked authority. That broader context is important, but even amid such chaos, the reports from the seminary stood out as unusually grim. By December, enough concern had mounted that county officials arranged a second, more formal inspection, this time to include a physician and 2 lay witnesses. Their journey to the seminary would prove to be the turning point, for what they recorded that winter became the foundation of what is now remembered as the disturbing case of the Holloway Seminary boys. The second inspection of Holloway Seminary took place in early December 1864, led by Constable Elias Rooker, accompanied by Dr. Nathan Cole and a shopkeeper named Alfred Wainwright, selected as a neutral lay witness. Their purpose was simple: to confirm conditions within the institution, examine the health of the boys, and settle complaints that had steadily gathered in county files. The group arrived in the morning hours, when frost still clung to the wooden rails of the fence. Rooker's surviving notes, preserved in fragmentary form, mention that Holloway greeted them at the threshold with outward politeness but visible agitation. He insisted the boys were well cared for, that discipline was strict but wholesome, and that rumors from the town were war-born fancies of idle neighbors. The 3 men were admitted to the main hall. Wainwright later testified that the air was stifling, heavy with the smell of damp wood and lamp oil, despite the morning sun. Boys sat in rows at long tables, their eyes fixed downward. Dr. Cole examined several, recording pallor of skin, marked thinness, and a tremor of the hands. One boy bore a scar across his cheek, another a burn across the wrist, yet both declined to answer when asked how such marks were made. Holloway dismissed these signs as accidents of youth. When the group requested entry to the dormitories, Holloway complied reluctantly. The rooms were cramped, 8 boys to a space meant for 4. Windows were nailed shut, shutters drawn. Bedding was threadbare, straw mattresses giving off a sour smell. Rooker noted, rooms closed off from air, boys listless, no evidence of outdoor exercise save a small yard bare of grass. It was at the cellar door that tension rose. Holloway refused entry, citing structural hazard and risk of collapse. Dr. Cole pressed the matter, arguing that health inspection could not be complete without access. An argument ensued, ending when Rooker declared that refusal would be recorded as obstruction. Holloway relented, producing a key from his coat. The witnesses descended by lantern light. Wainwright later recalled in deposition that the cellar was larger than expected, running the length of the house with stone walls damp and blackened. What struck them most was the presence of chains affixed to the wall at regular intervals, each fitted with iron rings. Near these were stains on the stone, dark and irregular. A foul odor lingered, though no bodies or remains were visible. Holloway insisted the chains were for securing supplies during floods, but none present found the explanation convincing. Dr. Cole's notes state plainly, apparatus of confinement, not storage, children likely restrained, air unfit for habitation. The inspectors concluded their visit in grim silence, promising to file a report with county authorities. Yet in the weeks that followed, little action was taken. War preoccupied the state. Officials hesitated to confront a man who still carried respect as a preacher. The report was entered, then set aside. Only fragments remain today, copied into later court transcripts, but they mark the moment when Holloway Seminary shifted from rumor into documented suspicion. Even then, the most disturbing revelations had yet to surface. In the first months of 1865, just as the bitterest winter of the war settled over the Ozarks, the Holloway Seminary case deepened. The inspection notes circulated quietly among county officials, yet no charges were brought. Holloway himself appeared at services in Forsyth and Springfield, assuring congregations that his school remained a pillar of order in a time of chaos. Some parents still entrusted their sons to him, grateful for any form of stability, but the list of names that failed to return home began to grow longer. Surviving ledger fragments, smudged and brittle, record fees paid for boys whose fates are uncertain. Joseph Raines, 14. Calvin Drury, 11. Samuel Keener, 13. In each case, a line follows their entry. departed, cause undisclosed. No bodies, no letters, and no possessions ever reached their families. One mother, Margaret Rains, wrote desperately to the county office demanding her son's effects, only to receive a short reply from Holloway. The boy left of his own accord. No property remains. Such answers soon failed to satisfy. A farmer named Owen Bristow testified later that he saw wagons depart the seminary under cover of night, heading toward the river bottoms. When challenged, Holloway explained that supplies were being moved due to infestation, but Bristow swore that the wagons carried not grain, but narrow bundles wrapped in cloth. Folklore embellished these reports. Locals whispered of shallow graves found in thickets near the ridge, though no markers remained. Hunters claimed to hear voices drifting from the hollow at dusk, chants in a cadence that chilled even seasoned woodsmen. Whether true or not, these tales set the community further on edge. By March, Reverend Samuel Grayson, who had earlier raised concerns, gathered affidavits from 4 families, urging the county to take firmer action. His appeal described gross neglect, confinement, and concealment of truth. He cited the American Civil War in Missouri as a reason for vigilance, noting that lawlessness was no excuse for cruelty behind closed doors. His letter to the presiding judge survives in a Methodist archive. If in these times of disorder we cannot safeguard the young, what future remains for this state? Yet the machinery of justice turned slowly. A hearing was scheduled for April, but before it could convene, a fire broke out in the western wing of the seminary. The blaze, contained before it consumed the structure, was explained away as an accident of chimney sparks. But in its aftermath, 2 boys disappeared from the rolls entirely, their names scratched out in Holloway's own hand. When investigators returned, Holloway claimed they had been sent home, though no family ever confirmed their arrival. In the shadow of war, with troops marching and supply lines threatened, the plight of a handful of boys seemed small. But for those who lived in the valley, the unease had hardened into fear. The case was no longer about strict discipline. It was about survival, secrecy, and the suggestion of something darker still hidden within those walls. The scheduled hearing of April 1865 drew unusual attention for so remote a county. Parents arrived from Springfield, Dent, and even farther afield, some on horseback, others in wagons marked by weeks of travel. Each carried questions about the boys entrusted to Reverend Holloway, and each carried papers, letters unanswered, fees unaccounted, possessions unrecovered. The county courthouse, a modest timber structure, was filled beyond capacity. Testimony began with Constable Rooker, who described the December inspection. He spoke plainly of the chain cellar and the pallor of the boys, yet his words were met with Holloway's fierce rebuttal. The Reverend insisted that his accusers were instruments of disorder, motivated by prejudice and the confusions of war. Witnesses from the town were then called. Mrs. Kinney repeated her account of silence at the dining hall. The farmer Bristow swore under oath to wagons leaving at night. Dr. Cole read his medical notes aloud, listing burns, scars, and malnutrition. The room fell quiet when Margaret Rains stood to describe her unanswered letters and the absence of her son. She held up the last scrap of correspondence, a page unsigned, written in an unfamiliar hand, declaring that her child had departed freely. She asked the court who could believe such a note came from a boy of 14. It was at this juncture that Holloway's defense faltered. He produced no records beyond what the court already held. When pressed about missing names, he muttered that some boys had been called to service, others to labor elsewhere. No testimony confirmed this. A jurist named James Cartwright, presiding, declared the inconsistencies troubling, but hesitated to issue a full indictment. The war weighed heavily upon proceedings. Resources were thin, constables few, and jails already crowded. Cartwright ordered that the seminary remain under observation, its operations restricted until further inquiry. Though measured, the ruling was a blow to Holloway's authority. What followed was stranger still. Within weeks of the hearing, neighbors reported the school falling into deeper isolation. Boys were seldom seen outside. Lamps burned at odd hours. Visitors were turned away. Two men riding patrol for Union forces claimed they passed the property and found the gates locked, the windows shuttered, the chimneys smoking thick, though no one answered their calls. These accounts, though informal, reached Grayson and his allies, who compiled them into a dossier for the state superintendent of schools. That file, now only partially surviving, contains a chilling line attributed to one anonymous informant. The boys do not speak because they dare not. Their silence is enforced not by reverence, but by threat. Despite mounting pressure, the machinery of justice again stalled. Records show no follow-up inspection in May or June, likely overshadowed by the war's final campaigns. Holloway continued his sermons, though his flock thinned. The seminary, once nominally respectable, now stood as a house of suspicion, and in the summer months, when the heat rose and the river fog thickened, the Holloway Seminary's true secrets began to seep out through accidents, through chance discoveries, and through the courage of boys who tried to flee. By July of 1865, the first reports of attempted escape from Holloway Seminary surfaced. They came not from the Reverend's records, which remained as vague as ever, but from townsfolk who encountered the boys in desperate flight. One account survives in the form of a sworn statement from a ferryman named Jonas Crisp. He testified that a lad of perhaps 15, pale and ragged, appeared at his crossing one evening, begging passage across the river. The boy gave no name, but muttered repeatedly, "They keep us below. They keep us below." Crisp attempted to question him further, but before he could ferry him across, two men from the seminary arrived, calling the boy a runaway. The lad was seized and returned, despite Crisp's unease. A second incident, this time noted in a Springfield Gazette, described a boy found wandering the road half a day's ride from the seminary. He bore rope marks about his wrists and refused to identify himself, only whispering that others remained in chains. He vanished from public view within days, reportedly reclaimed by Holloway himself. These stories, though fragmentary, spread rapidly. Parents still clinging to trust in the institution began to withdraw support, while others demanded investigation. Reverend Grayson, already a persistent critic, compiled these accounts into yet another petition, this time sending copies directly to Jefferson City. His language was restrained but damning. If such tales be fabrications, let them be dispelled by open inspection. If true, then justice demands intervention, for the welfare of the young is not to be abandoned even in war's shadow. Midway through that summer, physical evidence finally surfaced. A surveyor working the ridge discovered a shallow pit behind the seminary's grounds. In it lay a scattering of small bones, charred and brittle, though some argued they belonged to animals. The size and condition raised suspicions. The surveyor, a man named Benjamin McCaskill, filed a statement with the county clerk describing the pit and its odor of ash and lime. When officials inquired, Holloway dismissed it as the remains of livestock put down in time of disease. Yet no neighboring farmer admitted to losing stock in that year, and the explanation rang hollow. It was around this time that outside interest began to stir. Reporters, long preoccupied with the broader conflict, turned their attention to strange local cases now surfacing in the war's aftermath. The Holloway Seminary was mentioned in small columns of two separate papers, one in St. Louis, the other in Little Rock, each citing rumors of cruel confinement and unaccounted youth. Though cautious in tone, such notices broadened awareness of the institution's troubled reputation. References to the American Civil War in Missouri were sometimes woven into these articles, framing the seminary as a casualty of broader lawlessness, but locals knew the unease ran deeper. Rumors thickened, voices heard in the night, locked wagons, chains glimpsed in lantern glow. And with each month, the silence of the boys themselves seemed the most unsettling testimony of all. The arrival of state inspectors in August 1865 marked the first time Holloway Seminary faced scrutiny from beyond Taney County. Sent under the authority of the superintendent of schools in Jefferson City, the party included Inspector Harold Densmore, a physician named Dr. Abel Wright, and a clerk tasked with recording observations. Their orders were to assess conditions, review enrollment, and confirm or dismiss the allegations now circulating in regional papers. They traveled by carriage, escorted by 2 Union militiamen whose presence underscored the seriousness of the inquiry. Densmore's report, though incomplete, survives in fragments copied into later proceedings. It begins with measured formality. The Holloway Seminary, Taney County, presents outward appearance of an institution in order, yet inquiry reveals substantial irregularity in records, discipline, and health of residents. Upon arrival, the inspectors were met with Holloway's familiar resistance. He questioned their jurisdiction, arguing that his seminary was privately chartered and bound only to church oversight. Yet the presence of militia compelled him to admit them. The inspection began in the main hall, where boys once again sat in rows, silent and subdued. The clerk noted that when asked direct questions, most offered no response, glancing nervously toward Holloway. A handful whispered only that they were not permitted to speak. Densmore found the enrollment register heavily altered, names scratched out, new ones inserted in faint ink, some with no dates of admission. He remarked that of 20 boys listed for the term, only 14 were physically present. Holloway explained that 6 had departed to families, yet no letters or receipts were shown. Dr. Wright examined those present. His notes are clinical yet chilling. Skin sallow, several malnourished, scars upon arms consistent with Binden. One youth bearing fracture poorly healed. He concluded that conditions were unwholesome and cruel. When pressed about medical care, Holloway claimed the boys were treated with scripture, prayer, and tonic, but no physician's records could be produced. The inspectors then turned to the cellar. Holloway objected violently, declaring it off-limits, but under order from Densmore the lock was broken. What they found confirmed the darkest suspicions. The cellar walls bore chains, as noted before, but now fresh marks of abrasion were visible on the stone. A set of small wooden cots stood in a corner, some stained, one with straps affixed. Nearby, a ledger half-burned contained lists of supplies, lamp oil, lime, iron restraints, and quantities of laudanum. Densmore recorded tersely, "This is no place of education, but of confinement." Rumors among locals were vindicated, at least in part. The inspectors closed the seminary on provisional order, placing Holloway under county custody pending trial. The boys were dispersed to families or guardians, though several remained unclaimed, their origins unclear. For a moment it seemed the disturbing case would reach its resolution. Yet, as subsequent events proved, the closure of the seminary was not the end. Records would vanish, testimony would falter, and the Holloway case would sink back into obscurity, leaving only fragments and folklore in its wake. Reverend Josiah Holloway was taken into custody in late August 1865, confined in the Taney County jailhouse, a crude log structure scarcely fit for long detention. His arrest created a stir that spread beyond the Ozarks, drawing curiosity from neighboring counties and the press. Some viewed him as a man wrongfully maligned in the turmoil of war. Others whispered that far darker truths lay beneath the surface. Court records describe his initial demeanor as unshaken. He maintained that the inspectors had misinterpreted his methods, that silence and confinement were disciplines meant to mold unruly youth. He admitted to chaining boys in the cellar, but insisted it was for their safety when fever took them, lest they wander in delirium. No physician corroborated this claim. The trial convened in September, presided over by Judge Cartwright, the same who had earlier hesitated to indict. This time the evidence was heavier. The broken cellar lock, the ledger of restraints and laudanum, the testimony of inspectors. Yet almost at once, obstacles arose. The ledger disappeared from the clerk's desk, replaced only by charred scraps. Witnesses failed to appear, some reportedly threatened, others vanished altogether. Wainwright, the shopkeeper who had once testified, was said to have left the county suddenly, abandoning his store. Mrs. Kinney fell ill and did not attend. Dr. Wright, who had examined the boys, returned briefly to Jefferson City and never reappeared, citing illness in correspondence. With each absence, the case weakened. Holloway's defense leaned heavily on the disorder of the war years. His attorney argued that ledgers could not be trusted, that boys vanished daily to military service, and that scars and malnutrition were the natural lot of children in a ravaged state. He called on parishioners who swore Holloway preached faithfully and provided food where others sinned. Perverted. The courtroom, crowded with onlookers, heard both sides, but left with unease rather than certainty. Newspapers in St. Louis summarized the affair as a tangle of rumor, war, and clerical zealotry, offering little conclusion. Yet, in the midst of proceedings, something stranger occurred. A fire broke out in the courthouse annex one night, consuming several chests of documents. Among them were files relating to Holloway Seminary, including inspection notes and parental affidavits. Whether accidental or deliberate, no proof remains, but the timing unsettled many. In the end, Judge Cartwright ruled that while Holloway's methods were severe and questionable, no charge of murder or unlawful confinement could be sustained on the diminished evidence. Holloway was released under bond, ordered only to suspend the seminary until further review. The release infuriated families and emboldened folklore. Some declared that justice had been bought. Others whispered that the Reverend had friends in higher places. Whatever the truth, the seminary building itself remained shuttered, its doors barred, the boys dispersed. Yet the ridge where it stood did not fall silent. Locals spoke of strange lights seen at night, of doors banging though the building was empty, of voices rising faintly as if lessons continued below the earth. The case, unsettled and unresolved, began to pass from court to rumor, from record to tale. After his release in late 1865, Josiah Holloway did not return immediately to the seminary. Contemporary accounts suggest he remained in Springfield for several weeks, sheltered by distant relatives and supported by parishioners who still saw him as a victim of circumstance. Yet, in Taney County, his name had become synonymous with dread. Families whose children had vanished no longer sought answers from him, but rather from each other, piecing together their shared grief. Reports in the Springfield Union noted that Holloway expressed intent to reopen his school when calmer times prevailed. That intent was never realized. By early 1866, the seminary building itself stood abandoned, its windows shattered by storms, its fence collapsed. Boys once confined within its walls had scattered, some returned to kin, others placed in orphan homes, still others unaccounted for entirely. The structure, empty but not silent, became an object of fascination. A surveyor passing in April remarked in his notebook that the doors hung open, though he had closed them behind him only hours before. Another wrote of a low sound of recitation heard when standing near the cellar grates, as if voices still repeated lessons long since ended. Farmers avoided the ridge, guiding wagons by longer routes. By midsummer, scavengers stripped boards from the house. One party claimed to find beneath a loose floorboard a child's slate scratched with markings, rows of tally marks ending abruptly. The artifact has since been lost, but its mention appears in a later affidavit filed during a property dispute. Holloway himself drifted from the region. Records place him in Arkansas briefly, preaching to scattered congregations, then in Illinois by 1868. His trail grows faint afterward, though a stray notice in a St. Louis Gazette mentions a Reverend J.P. Holloway delivering a sermon on obedience. Whether the same man or not remains uncertain. What persisted, however, was the seminary's reputation. Even when the building collapsed into ruin, its stones scavenged for nearby barns, locals continued to speak of it in hushed tones. A Methodist archivist writing decades later described the Holloway affair as an unresolved scar on the Ozarks, where law failed and silence prevailed. The broader context of the American Civil War in Missouri often served as an explanation for the lack of clarity, chaos, lawlessness, the collapse of oversight. Yet many who lived nearby insisted the war was only the backdrop, not the cause. Something within those walls, they said, belonged to Holloway alone. By the end of the decade, the land had changed hands twice, neither owner remaining long. Tax records show arrears, abandoned claims, and sudden sales. One deed carries a margin note in an unfamiliar hand. House not fit for habitation, ground uneasy. It was the last official reference to the Holloway Seminary for many years. In silence and in ruin, it began its second life, not as a school, but as a story whispered in kitchens and at campfires, a warning to children who wandered too close to the ridge. By the 1870s, the Holloway Seminary had ceased to exist in any official record. No new deeds were filed under its name, no advertisements appeared in newspapers, and no clerical endorsement survived. What remained was memory, fractured and often inconsistent, passed along through the voices of neighbors. In Taney County, the phrase "sent to Holloway's" became a dark shorthand among parents warning children of disobedience. One settler, writing in a family diary in 1873, recalled hearing an elder whisper, "Keep still, or Holloway will have you in the cellar." These oral echoes preserved the story even as the physical site decayed. The ruins themselves drew occasional visitors. Hunters described finding initials carved into timbers, some of which did not match known families in the county. Travelers along the ridge claimed to hear soft tapping beneath the soil, as if from boards laid underground. While many dismissed these tales as folklore, they gave weight to the lingering unease that the seminary had never been fully explained. Scholars of the region later noted how the Holloway affair merged with broader anxieties of the post-war Ozarks, fear of lawlessness, suspicion of outsiders, and grief over children lost without record. When the American Civil War in Missouri was recalled in veteran circles, the story of the seminary sometimes surfaced as a cautionary footnote, a reminder that not all casualties of that conflict bore uniforms. Archival work in the late 19th century recovered fragments of testimony. Reverend Grayson, who had campaigned so vigorously against Holloway, left behind notes preserved by his descendants. These describe boys silent as stone and a ledger half burned, yet bearing names crossed in haste. A Methodist quarterly reprinted part of his appeal in 1881, ensuring the memory would not vanish entirely. At the same time, folklore embellished what fact could not confirm. Some said Holloway had conducted secret rites in the cellar, blending scripture with practices unfit to name. Others claimed the missing boys were not dead but hidden, spirited away to labor in distant camps. Such rumors flourished in the absence of resolution. By the turn of the century, the ridge where the seminary once stood was marked only by scattered stones and a grove of oaks. Local children dared each other to spend nights there, reporting voices in the wind or the sensation of being counted by unseen figures. These were stories fit more for campfire than courtroom, yet they carried the weight of a past never properly accounted. The Holloway case, unsettling in its incompleteness, had shifted from record into legend. But the unease it left behind was real as the missing names in county ledgers and the unanswered letters of grieving parents. In the early 20th century, interest in the Holloway Seminary case was revived not by locals, but by researchers drawn to the Ozarks' hidden histories. The Missouri Historical Society began compiling scattered accounts of schools and institutions that had disappeared during the years of the American Civil War. Among these files surfaced fragments from Taney County, partial ledgers, court transcriptions, and a handful of depositions bearing Holloway's name. Archivist Leonard Bowers, working in the 1920s, wrote that the documents were like bones without flesh, suggestive but incomplete. He noted that entire pages from the inspection reports were missing, often replaced by margins smudged with soot. One surviving entry from Inspector Densmore's clerk reads only, "Chains, stains, and silence. Explanation unconvincing." Bowers concluded that deliberate destruction of records was likely, pointing to the courthouse fire of 1865. At the same time, oral history collectors recorded the recollections of elderly residents whose parents had lived near the seminary. These testimonies, though filtered through decades, retained unsettling details. One man recalled his father describing boys too thin for their years, walking 2 by 2, eyes never meeting the passerby. A woman spoke of her grandmother's memory of wagons with covered loads leaving the ridge on moonless nights. Such accounts blurred fact and folklore, yet their persistence underscored the deep impression the seminary had left on the community. A handful of writers folded the case into broader studies of Ozark superstition, suggesting the site had become a locus for ghost stories. Hunters were said to hear voices at dusk. Farmhands avoided the ridge, claiming unease without cause. Though dismissed as legend by many, these tales carried eerie consistency. Silence, chains, and doors that opened when no one stood near. And the most substantial rediscovery came in 1934, when a packet of letters surfaced in a private collection in Springfield. These included correspondence from Reverend Grayson pleading for intervention, and replies from Jefferson City acknowledging his concerns, but citing limited resources due to wartime demand. The letters painted a clear picture of neglect, not only by Holloway, but by the very institutions meant to regulate him. That context deepened understanding of how the case slipped into obscurity. Scholars connected these findings back to the broader narrative of the Civil War's disruption in Missouri, where law and order were often suspended and oversight collapsed. Yet even with new fragments, the central questions remained. What became of the boys unaccounted for? Why were so many names scratched from ledgers, their trails vanishing into ash and rumor? By mid-century, the Holloway Seminary was referenced in academic journals less as a solved crime than as a cautionary study of lost oversight in fractured times. By the mid-20th century, the Holloway Seminary was no longer discussed in courtrooms or archives, but in kitchens, barbershops, and campfire circles. The ridge where it once stood had long since been reclaimed by trees, yet its name endured in ghost stories told to children and travelers passing through the Ozarks. Folklore researchers in the 1950s recorded dozens of variations. Some described the sound of a school bell ringing faintly at dusk, though no bell was ever confirmed to have hung in the seminary. Others spoke of lantern light flickering among the trees, as if a procession of boys still moved under watch. One tale repeated often was that of the silent recitation. Hikers claimed to hear low voices chanting lessons in unison, stopping abruptly when footsteps approached. Though dismissed as rural fancy, these accounts spread, carried by hunters and wanderers who knew the ridge well. Newspaper features occasionally revisited the story, framing it as a regional curiosity. A 1957 article in the Ozark Herald referred to the seminary as Missouri's Forgotten School of Shadows, blending archival fragments with ghostly retellings. Letters to the editor followed, some from locals insisting the building had stood until the 1880s, others arguing it was gone far earlier. The inconsistencies only deepened the mystery. Families still whispered of names missing from their ancestry, children sent to Holloway's care who left no further trace. Such gaps in genealogy lent weight to the darker versions of the tale. The American Civil War in Missouri was often invoked in these stories, not as direct cause but as setting, a time when oversight collapsed and men like Holloway could operate unchecked. Storytellers described him alternately as a cruel zealot, a failed preacher, or a figure dabbling in rites beyond Scripture. No account agreed fully, yet all agreed on the atmosphere. Silence, confinement, and loss. By the 1960s, the ridge itself had become a destination for those seeking eerie experiences. Teenagers dared each other to spend nights there, reporting the sensation of being watched or finding doors in their dreams that led downward into unseen cellars. Local sheriffs occasionally chased trespassers from the site, but the stories continued, fueled by each retelling. Some folklorists suggested the persistence of the Holloway legend reflected deeper anxieties about vanished children, authority misused, and history never properly closed. Whatever the explanation, the seminary's shadow lingered long after its timbers were gone. It had passed fully into legend, yet always tethered to fragments of truth, the missing names in ledgers, the unanswered letters of parents, and the reports of inspectors who once walked its halls. In the latter half of the 20th century, the Holloway Seminary Ridge attracted a new kind of attention. Amateur historians and emerging paranormal societies, spurred by growing interest in folklore and the supernatural, began to visit the site. What they found was little more than overgrowth and scattered stones, yet many reported sensations that seemed out of proportion to the emptiness. A 1972 local historical bulletin recounts the work of a group calling themselves the Ozark Record Society. They claim to have located foundation stones, fragments of iron fittings, and what they described as a depression consistent with a cellar entrance. Their notes, while cautious, remark on an unsettling stillness that deepened as evening fell. Members of the group disagreed on whether the cellar depression was natural or man-made, but the rumor quickly spread that Holloway's infamous underground chamber had been rediscovered. At the same time, paranormal enthusiasts brought tape recorders and cameras to the ridge. Several claimed to capture faint voices on their reels, low chants, or the sound of children reciting. These recordings were never authenticated and are now lost to time, but they fueled the legend. Local papers in the 1970s and 80s occasionally ran features about the seminary, pairing the story with other Ozark hauntings. Such coverage blurred lines between history and ghost tale, ensuring that Holloway's name remained alive in public imagination. Not all who investigated sought spirits. Some genealogists combed through county and church records, hoping to resolve the fates of the missing boys. A handful of names were traced. One found later enlisted in a Union regiment, another possibly relocated to Arkansas, but many remained unaccounted for. The gaps resisted closure, leaving the darker explanations to persist. Archaeological interest peaked briefly in 1989. A university field team surveyed the ridge. Their official report described stone scatter consistent with a mid-19th century structure, but found no conclusive artifacts. Yet team members privately noted that compasses behaved oddly on the site, their needles drifting erratically. Whether a quirk of mineral deposits or imagination, the anomaly became part of the lore. By the century's end, the Holloway Seminary story occupied a strange space, part documented case of neglect and disappearance, part ghost legend, part unresolved puzzle. References to the American Civil War in Missouri often framed it as a byproduct of a chaotic era. Yet those who stood on the ridge after sunset seldom invoked history. They spoke instead of silence, of voices in the dark, and of doors no longer standing yet. Somehow felt all the same. By the 1990s, the Holloway Seminary case had escaped the confines of regional memory and entered broader popular culture. Small press books on Ozark hauntings devoted chapters to the story, mixing fragments of court records with chilling folklore. One paperback from 1994, Schools of Shadows, Forgotten Institutions of the Ozarks, presented Holloway's story alongside abandoned orphanages, blending fact and speculation until the two were nearly indistinguishable. Late-night radio gave the tale a new audience. Call-in shows discussing ghost stories frequently mentioned the seminary, with listeners claiming their grandparents had warned them never to linger near the ridge. Some callers swore they had seen the procession of boys walking in line at dusk, a vision that always faded before one could approach. Such anecdotes, unverifiable yet eerily consistent, kept the legend alive far from Missouri. Documentaries followed. A regional public television series in 2001 aired an episode titled The Seminary on the Ridge, interviewing local historians and including dramatized reconstructions. Though careful to emphasize the uncertainty of the records, the program lingered on details, the chains, the cellar, the missing names, that struck viewers more deeply than any conclusion. Paranormal television shows in the mid-2000s attempted investigations, setting up cameras and sensors on the ridge. One broadcast featured grainy footage of what appeared to be a door closing in the ruins, though no door remained standing. Skeptics dismissed it as editing, but for believers, it became further proof. The Internet era expanded the reach still further. Forums in the early 2000s hosted long threads debating Holloway's guilt, sharing scans of affidavits and recounting supposed encounters. Photos of the ridge circulated, often indistinct, showing mist or strange light. The Holloway Seminary had become a story untethered from its local soil, a narrative carried into digital spaces and adopted by a global audience. Yet amid all this, the core of the case, the unanswered questions of the boys' fates, remained unchanged. Genealogists continued to search. Historians continued to cite the war's chaos as explanation, but no record closed the matter. That persistence, the refusal of the past to yield clarity, became its own source of unease. References to the American Civil War in Missouri still surfaced in scholarly articles, situating Holloway's Seminary within a landscape of lawlessness and abandoned institutions. But in popular retellings, the war was often forgotten, replaced instead by the haunting image of a locked cellar where boys whispered in silence. In the present day, the Holloway Seminary Ridge has become a quiet but persistent destination for those drawn to dark history. While no official marker identifies the site, local guides occasionally include it in informal folklore tours of the Ozarks. Visitors are led along winding trails until they reach a clearing where stones lie scattered and the earth dips in a shallow depression said to mark the cellar. There is little to see, yet much to feel. Hikers often describe a sudden stillness, as if the air grows heavy. Some report hearing faint knocks, others a rhythm-like recitation just beyond perception. Though skeptical voices attribute these sensations to the wind or to expectation, the consistency of the reports gives pause. Tourism literature rarely mentions the site, yet word of mouth ensures its inclusion on lists of hidden haunted places in Missouri. Amateur investigators return regularly, posting videos online. In one clip, a camera lingers on the ruins while a voice recorder picks up what some interpret as murmured counting. In another, a flashlight dims inexplicably when aimed toward the cellar depression. Such evidence, while inconclusive, keeps the legend alive. For locals, the seminary remains a point of uneasy pride. It is a story they neither celebrate nor entirely ignore. Parents still caution children against wandering there, half out of tradition, half out of lingering fear. Hunters passing through the ridge sometimes find their dogs refusing to enter the clearing. A few families who settled nearby speak of dreams in which doors appear, doors standing alone in the woods, leading downward, though no cellar remains. In regional folklore festivals, storytellers weave the Holloway case into broader tales of lost children and restless spirits. Some recount it as a cautionary tale of misplaced trust in authority, others as a ghost story with no end. American Civil War in Missouri is occasionally invoked to explain the atmosphere of lawlessness in which Holloway operated, yet listeners are most captivated by the image of boys standing silent in rows, a preacher's voice commanding them in the dark. Even today, researchers and enthusiasts continue to comb archives, hoping for a missing page, a forgotten letter, anything that might close the record. But each search returns the same: fragments, silences, and contradictions. The seminary lingers not as a solved crime, but as an unresolved presence, half in history and half in legend. The legacy of the Holloway Seminary is not found in textbooks or official commemorations, but in the uneasy persistence of its memory. More than a century and a half after its closing, the case resists resolution. County ledgers still carry names that vanish without follow-up, parents' letters remain unanswered, and inspection notes are reduced to fragments. Scholars argue over whether the boys were lost to war, to disease, or to something more deliberate, yet none can prove their conclusions. That absence of clarity is what allows the seminary to endure as both history and folklore. In the Ozarks, stories of the site continue to shift with each generation. Older residents speak of their grandparents' warning never to climb the ridge at dusk. Younger storytellers fold it into broader tales of haunted Missouri, pairing it with ghost lights and abandoned mines. In each retelling, certain details never change: the silence of the boys, the chains in the cellar, and the man who insisted it was all discipline. Holloway himself remains an ambiguous figure. Some accounts paint him as a cruel zealot, others as a man crushed by wartime chaos, still others as something darker altogether. His trail after release disappears into scattered mentions, as if he too was swallowed by the silence he enforced. Even academic references to the American Civil War in Missouri sometimes use the seminary as illustration, not of battles or politics, but of the collapse of oversight that left children vulnerable in forgotten corners of the state. For locals, however, the war is only backdrop. What lingers is the ridge itself, where visitors still describe a presence difficult to name. A folklorist, writing in 1998, captured it well. There are places where the past does not rest. The Holloway Seminary is one. It does not speak in history's voice, but in silence carried on the air. That silence is perhaps the most disturbing inheritance. It suggests that the truth, whatever it was not only hidden, but extinguished, leaving behind echoes with no source. And yet, those echoes continue to shape the ridge, the community, and the legend that refuses to die. Today, the Holloway Seminary exists only in fragments, burned records, scattered testimonies, and the folklore of the Ozarks. The building is gone, its timbers long since repurposed or rotted into the earth, yet its presence lingers stubbornly. Visitors who climb the ridge sometimes describe the air as colder in the clearing, or the sense that doors stand where no walls remain. Locals still tell of hearing recitations at dusk, words too faint to decipher but steady in their rhythm, like lessons never ended. The missing names, boys once entered in ledgers and then erased, remain the most haunting evidence. Their fates are unknown, their voices absent from family lines. Some may indeed have been lost to war, others to disease, but the silence surrounding their disappearance casts doubt that time alone can explain. Every generation that revisits the case finds itself staring into the same gaps. A ledger scorched, a letter unsigned, a cellar described but never excavated. Historians point to the American Civil War in Missouri as the context that allowed such neglect to persist. But context does not account for the details, the chains, the bruises, the whispered words of escape. Folklore has filled the void. Hunters claim to see pale figures moving in line through the trees. Campers speak of dreams where they wake to find themselves counted among unseen rows. Hikers swear they hear a door closing behind them, though the forest stands open. These stories are not evidence, but they carry the unease that the Holloway Seminary left behind, that something remains unfinished, that silence itself can be testimony. The case ends not with resolution, but with absence. Records burned, witnesses gone, and the ridge reclaimed by roots and stone. Yet the story endures, told and retold, unsettling in its refusal to conclude. For those who pass through Taney County, the ridge above the White River is only another patch of trees. But for those who know the history, it is a place where the past still presses close, where the air carries the weight of unanswered questions, and where silence is heavier than sound. In the end, the Holloway Seminary is remembered not for what is proven, but for what remains unspoken. A disturbing case that the Missouri Ozarks never fully put to rest.